There we go. Okay. Welcome everyone to another e-meetup for the Charlotte chapter of the Neoliberal Project. Tonight we have a Q&A with North Carolina Commissioner of Agriculture candidate, Jenna Wadsworth. Pretty excited for this one. This is our second Q&A with a candidate for the Council of State, which is sort of the, I guess you could say like the governor's cabinet. So 4 weeks ago, we had the candidate for treasurer, Ronnie Chatterjee, on. It was really fun. And we have about the same number of people this time, so this is really exciting. I want to keep doing stuff like this. I think I've mentioned in every meetup almost since the beginning. If you have an idea, just drop it in the Facebook group or send me a message. And if you guys know people, or I'll reach out. These are really excellent, fun events. So I would love to keep doing these. All right, Jenna, let's jump right in. The sort of easy get to know you is tell us about yourself, what you've done, and how that sort of relates to the Office of Agricultural Commissioner.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me and for putting this on. I think this is an amazing resource for folks to get to know the candidates, especially, you know, in a kind of personal way, but to learn about the issues that we deal with that actually affect your life every single day. And I would say that the Commissioner of Agriculture is one of those offices that a lot of times you either, folks either skip or they just, vote for the name that sounds most familiar, but you aren't quite sure how this office impacts you every single day. So again, my name is Jenna Wadsworth. I'm the Democratic nominee for the Office of North Carolina Commissioner of Agriculture. And I've actually, I grew up on a hog, cow, chicken, corn, cotton, tobacco, and soybean farm on a dirt road in Johnson County. So I am an Eastern North Carolina girl. Don't hold that against me. It was my grandparents' farm. And actually my father and I now kind of run and manage most of the operations. We rent the bulk of the land just by virtue of running a statewide campaign. My schedule is a little crazy, or at least it was pre-COVID. And between his age, but we do several acres of garden every season. I have just put in over 45 rows of fruits and vegetables this season. So I'm pretty excited about getting to harvest all of that later this summer. And but growing up, we also raised animals in addition to growing fruits and vegetables. So I'm still very much involved with the farm. And I'm so grateful to have grown up that way. I think like a lot of people, I did not realize that until after I left home. I left home when I was 16. I got a state grant to do coastal geology research at UNCW. And then I went to the North Carolina School of Science and Mathematics in Durham. Proud graduate of the school. I actually sit on one of the Alumni Association Board of Directors and have been very involved with the formation of the Western campus that will be opening in Morganton, but has been delayed a year between the legislature not prioritizing education and everything else, but talked about this idea of having, the curriculum there look at the natural resources available and talk about agriculture being a field that we should encourage our best and brightest to go into. Because I think there's a lot of misconceptions about the folks that are farmers, and, every farmer I know has to be, a scientist and a physicist and an engineer and doing everything else too. So I think it's really important to encourage people to go back into this career. And you can't do that if there aren't viable opportunities, which I know we'll talk about a little bit later, my plans for that. But just fast forwarding, I am also a graduate of NC State, but while I was at NC State, ran for office, made history in North Carolina as the youngest woman ever elected to any political office in the state, when at the age of 21, I was elected to the nonpartisan Wake County Soil and Water Conservation District Board of Supervisors. It is a mouthful no matter how many years I've been saying it, but I was elected in 2010, re-elected in 2014, and again in 2018. I became vice chair of the board in 2015, and we have done some pretty groundbreaking work with conservation in Wake County. I think that, soil and water conservation, which we have in basically every county in North Carolina, this board, you all have a pretty good one in MEC. It not only falls under the North Carolina Department of Agriculture, the Soil and Water Conservation Districts. My opponent was a soil and water supervisor before he became Commissioner of Agriculture. But we have done some groundbreaking work with easements, with working with the U.S. Marine Corps and the Navy to help install to help work with a project with farmers that had land under a vital military flight training path. We have made significant and considerable investments in environmental education programming in both our public and private schools. That is something that has been really important to me, everything from outdoor classrooms to environmental education, science curriculum development. And I'm so excited about the work that we've done on this level. And I'm ready to take that challenge and go to the state level and talk about things like climate change and social justice and environmental justice, things that haven't been talked about, and immigrants' rights. From this office before, but that you have a very real platform and an opportunity to talk about and address.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot that's covered, especially with immigrant rights broadly. Given Georgia had the small experiment where they basically banned undocumented laborers, and they wound up with food rotting in the fields.
Yeah, you have to ask yourself. Every farmer, whether they're Democrat, Republican, or Independent, that I ask, how do they feel about immigration? Almost all of them will say, well, how do you feel about eating?
Mm-hmm. It's and our group's very, very much pro immigrant and immigration and the free flow of people. So this is excellent to touch on.
Human rights to me.
Mm-hmm. Going on, so you sort of touched on with kind of vaguely, but what else can you tell us about sort of what the Commissioner of Agriculture is responsible for? Is it as broad as the Department of Environmental Quality, or is that something else? Are you just rural areas, or do you have any sort of urban responsibilities?
Great. So the Department of Agriculture, it's separate from Department of Environmental Quality. There kind of used to be more collaboration. Now there's not, in part because the commissioner does not really prioritize environmental issues. Now that being said, the North Carolina Department of Agriculture is actually one of the largest state cabinet departments. You oversee the food and fiber production in the state. You also oversee the marketing, the development of new crop opportunities. You help to market and create sales opportunities for anything that's grown here, anything that's produced here, anything that's raised or caught here. So that includes seafood too. Forestry falls under the Department of Agriculture. A lot of folks don't realize that, as well as consumer services. That's the rest of the titles: North Carolina Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. So everything from food and drug testing to weights and measures, price checking, and scanner checking at your grocery store to make sure that the price on the shelf matches the price that you're paying when you check out, and that you're actually getting the quantity of product that it says on the label. So just kind of being a consumer watchdog. And in addition to like food and drug, you're also talking about cosmetics. You also oversee pesticides, chemicals, application and permitting and licensing, which I'm sure you probably have some questions about as well, given some of the issues that we've faced here in North Carolina in the last few years. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that falls underneath the department, and it impacts you each and every single day. Some environmental services do natural disasters, if there's planning or preparation for any potential terror attacks. You have to think about what the food supply would look like going forward. So all of that falls under the Department of Agriculture. And agriculture in North Carolina, I just feel like it's just really important to just throw out a couple facts, just so you can kind of situate yourself. There's over 49,000 farms, 49,500 at the last check in North Carolina, situated on over almost 8.5 million acres. And the average farm size in North Carolina is something like 168 acres. And, I know that sounds large, especially for those of us maybe that live in Raleigh or that live in Charlotte. But the USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, says that a small farm is considered 172 acres or less. So that means that the bulk of our farms fall under what nationally they would consider small farms. And on top of that, agriculture in North Carolina is one of our biggest industries. It grosses around $91.8 billion annually. And the department itself has the biggest statewide budget out of any of the council estate offices. So it normally is around about $275 million a year that the commissioner is responsible for overseeing. That amount of money increases during years where there's disaster payments, so especially like after any major hurricane or anything else. This past year, the budget swelled to something like $600 million. A lot of that was disaster and recovery payments and putting people back to work or getting people back to work on their farms after some of these devastating hurricanes and flood events that we faced in the last few years. And I think something else that's really interesting with this department is there are currently over 21 divisions, and the commissioner has the ability to modify those and change them when a new commissioner comes into office, kind of what those major divisions are. And there are employees that the commissioner is responsible for in 99 out of our 100 counties. So, I mean, this is really a commissioner who has people located throughout the state overseeing everything from forestry to fisheries to wildlife to consumer services to the scales that people are using commercially and industrially. And, the only other thing I would say is, just to think about how many people agriculture in general, so not just under the commissioner, but agriculture in general throughout the state employs over 700,000 people. So that's a considerable number of people involved in the workforce that are involved in agriculture here in our state.
Yeah, and sort of, I guess, because I do a lot of work with NCDOT, their operating budget for a typical year is about $5 billion. So it's to give everyone else sort of a sense of scale. There it is. All the road projects that you see on a state operated road is sort of a drop in the bucket to agriculture. So next up, the incumbent is Steve Troxler. You've sort of touched on he's not really into environmental issues, but what are some key differences between your platforms?
Sure. So Commissioner Troxler has been in this office since he ran for the first, he ran in 2004. Technically was not sworn in until kind of early 2005, has been serving in this office since then. I would largely say in that time that he's grown complacent. He has been bought and paid for by special interests like Monsanto and Smithfield Foods and a lot of the big chemical companies, Farm Bureau, and you don't have to take my word for it. This is all available through the North Carolina Board of Elections website if you want to check for yourself. But I have to wonder, when I had farmers calling me today talking about a pipeline that's going to cut straight through their farm, straight through their property in Eastern North Carolina, and the reason why has the commissioner not said anything about it? Well, it's because he's taken plenty of money from petrochemicals, from oil and gas lobbyists. And that's problematic to me, right? Meanwhile, we continue to see one of the biggest issues we face in agriculture is farmland preservation, so farm loss. And, despite the negative implications that some may assign to farming and agriculture, because you're thinking about that large scale production ag, most farmers are smaller farmers. Most want to be good neighbors. They want to be conservationists because if they aren't, then their land won't be productive for generations to come. The problem is small farmers right now do not have a resource in the department. The department prioritizes those large scale factory farmers. They take money from them. The small farms division right now in the department is very small. And it encompasses not just small farmers, but all minority-owned farms or non-traditional farms, which maybe even includes female-owned farms or farms with younger operators. And so all of that gets lumped together, even though I just discussed that the average farm size is considered a small family farm in North Carolina. But we're not prioritizing those. We're prioritizing those ones with massive industrial contracts that can get away with polluting our air, water, and natural resources, and then giving every single person in agriculture a bad reputation. So I would say there's a huge focus on the difference of, small versus factory farming support. People who, I can't imagine ever taking money from the chemical lobby or oil and gas lobby and then having to be the person who decides ultimately how those industries are managed and overseen in my state. That's a huge conflict of interest to me. I don't see how anybody could say that it's anything different than that. So that is a big thing. And then obviously, you know, I have had a huge focus from day one talking about social and environmental justice. I talk about communities of color, how they're policed, especially in regards to the potential for marijuana to become a crop here in North Carolina. I think we might be touching on that a little bit later. You know, that there's never been a discussion about cannabis out of this commissioner. There has never been this commissioner being willing to say we need to fight to be able to see a pathway to citizenship for our farm workers. Even now, as COVID-19 has created these major meat shortages and these issues with, like you alluded to, vegetables that are being, you know, that are rotting out in fields, or, you know, producers that are having to dump milk, or that are having to thin their herds and literally just kill off like piglets or chickens. There's been no discussion about the laborers, the people who are doing that work day in and day out. The bulk of them on the farms and both in the meatpacking plants are immigrants. Instead, we could have been talking about how the department is going to be willing to provide additional PPE or make it possible for these folks to live in safe conditions and have access to health care, you know, which I think is the bare minimum, or have a living wage, but we don't discuss that. We don't discuss that, whether it's COVID or like just any other day of the week when we are relying on these people to make the agricultural industry work. And so that really is problematic to me if you've become so detached from the people who are doing the hard work day in, day out to make sure that you have food on your table and clothes on your backs.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I'm going to switch questions 4 and 5 around, since we'll stay sort of out east and these large farming operations, which if anyone ever sees the acronym CAFO, that's Concentrated Animal Farming Operation. So out east is where you have a lot of these massive, I think one of the largest meat packing factories in the country is out east, near Fayetteville.
We have a bunch of meat packing plants here in North
Oh,
Carolina.
it's a huge thing, and there's all these news stories
outbreak.
Yeah, and there's all these news stories that pop up every so often for the pig waste lagoons and things like that. What are your thoughts on clean hog farming and these CAFOs, these concentrated animal farming operations?
Yeah, so CAFOs, again, this goes back to what I think has gone so wrong about agriculture in the last few years. Here in America, we have become accustomed to cheap, quick, and easy. And I mean that in terms of so many things, but in particular in regards to our food and farming system. We don't realize what we should actually be paying for a gallon of milk or for a dozen eggs. And we have easily as consumers detached ourselves from the moral, sustainable, and ethical reality of how most of our food is produced. Not just that, but the food on an average American plate comes from between 1,300 and 1,500 miles away. So think about all the greenhouse gases that are emitted in the process of traveling, packing and traveling and shipping your food to you. Largely, we have set up the agricultural industry to fail. I think that's pretty evident right now, since there are food shortages left and right. There's inability for people to eat meat, but meanwhile, there are food banks that don't have enough food available to them, while there are farmers that have tons of produce rotting in the field. And so there is a mismatch. There is something that has gone wrong. We have subsidized the wrong things in this country for far too long. The dairy industry has been operating at a loss for over a decade federally. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't make it feasible for dairy to be able to operate without there being a loss. I'm just saying right now we have made it impossible for them to think that they're ever going to be able to do other than what they're doing now. Same thing with, you talk about these concentrated animal feeding operations, when you're talking about big pork, when you're talking about the beef industry, when you're talking about the chicken industry, and there are a ton of poultry plants and operations and farms that have popped up overnight in North Carolina, especially down east. A lot of them are operated around, have been located around the same area as those hog farms, and they actually produce just as much, if not more, you know, toxic and volatile chemical compounds that are just being flushed into the water system as these hog farms. But we aren't talking about them because legislators allowed the lobbyists to say, hey, we don't want there to be any sort of like oversight into what we're doing on these poultry operations or on these poultry farms. We don't want there to be any kind of oversight into what happens with waste management. And that is problematic, right? We have let, you know, the loudest voices in the room have control over our policy at both the state or federal level. And we have made it almost impossible for small family farmers to operate successfully and make money because the big boys can sell the, you know, cuts of meat for a fraction of the cost. And so we have to change people's hearts and minds. We have to get back to our roots of eating locally, eating seasonally, and we have to give small farmers an economic opportunity to be successful. I have seen it done right. It's possible to make money and do the morally and ethically correct thing when it comes to our food system. There's a group of women called Blue Ridge Women in Agriculture in North Carolina. They are doing some really groundbreaking work up in the mountains near Boone. And they've also helped start something called the High Country Food Hub. And so this is a local food system that has been very successful. And not just that, it has shown that it's made about twice the amount of money within 1 year, you know, within a year of operation, which shows that there's demand for people to know where their food comes from, to know how it was produced. I think, you know, millennials get a bad rep for a lot of things. You know, we're told that we've destroyed and ended the straw industry and the big box store industry and the napkin industry. But something that's been, I think, really important to my generation is knowing where our food comes from and making a very concerted choice to be able to buy organic or to buy local. And so we have to give these small farmers the opportunity to compete economically. We have to also give them the technological tools so they can effectively market their products and get to know their consumers, and their consumers can get to know them. And we have to teach them how to use those tools, because the average age of the farmer is, you know, anywhere from 56 to 68, depending upon where you're looking at in the state of North Carolina. And there's also not broadband in a lot of those places, which is hard, again, for people like you and me and Charlotte or Raleigh to think about. But there are places where dial-up is, you know, you're lucky to get that. And so there are so many things that we can do, but we can't continually bail out the people who are doing things the wrong way and then make it harder for the people who want to do it the right way from succeeding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Sarah Tabor's out east in Fayetteville is a really good resource. She will sort of highlight some small minority-owned farms in North Carolina and sort of the struggles they face. And it's yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was just going to say the other thing about the CAFOs that I think is really interesting. So my team was pulling some more research today. Like I read pretty ferociously, excuse me. And something I thought was interesting is, you know, and I mean, I knew this, but to see the actual numbers. So the thing about these concentrated animal feeding operations is they tend to be, you know, located in places where people don't have the political clout or power to fight back or fight against them. And so, you know, it's just like what you've seen with the Smithfield lawsuits. They're more, you know, people are disproportionately likely, you know, to be African American, Hispanic, or Native American if they're living within 3 miles of any North Carolina pig farm down east. And they're, you know, it's anywhere from 1.5 to 2.5 times more likely that they are a member of a minority group. Not just that, but when you're talking about kind of all the things that these animal feeding operations do and kind of speeding up climate change and releasing these volatile organic compounds, one of which is ammonia, which, by the way, federally is not regulated. So you can continue to put out as much ammonia as you want, and that will go unchecked and unregulated. But, you know, you're seeing issues with increased, not just water pollution, but air pollution. And children's lungs, they inhale 20 to 50% more air than adults do every time they breathe. And, you know, and so they are at an increased risk for developing asthma or other bronchial issues as a result of living next to these operations. So we are literally putting our children at risk, and we're saying it's okay to sacrifice them in order to see, you know, the bottom line met for these big companies that don't care about their employees or their neighbors.
Mm-hmm. Sort of touching on that, I guess, with like air quality and kind of going more to an urban setting. So like North Carolina is rapidly growing. I know the one fact I have off the top of my head is Charlotte's growing 50 to 70 people a day, depending on when the study's done. Every day of the year, it's just kind of mind-boggling, which is why we have all the sprawl and traffic that we do. But what issues is the commissioner responsible for that are city-centric or townships, areas that aren't, you know, like from even a small family farm up larger? Is there anything that you would want to promote in terms of like urban gardening and ways to you know, increase that local food supply to help solve these supply chain issues?
Absolutely. I think, you know, the current commissioner, if there's not some idea, like some way that a profit can be made, it doesn't seem like a viable alternative to pursuing. So, you know, I think that there is so much that we can get out of community gardens, talking about small gardens, urban gardens. So for instance, you know, North Carolina is blessed to have two of the best agricultural research institutions in the country, in NC State and then A&T. But a lot of times, and I'm an NC State girl, but a lot of times A&T does not get the funding or grant awards that they should, especially because they're doing some of the most groundbreaking work in the country, talking about urban farming and the future of agriculture in urban settings, and especially looking at minority and female-owned farms, which are the bulk of second-generation farm ownership, or what farming will look like as we move forward with this increase in population. And so when you talk about actually being able to feed people, and then, you know, the other things that we were alluding to earlier, this idea that people want to know where their food comes from. And I think COVID has resulted in kind of a return back to our roots in a lot of ways. People are planting a garden, some of them for the first time ever. I know because every time I turn around, I get asked how to do that from folks throughout the state, which I've actually really enjoyed. But, you know, I think that we could absolutely focus on agriculture in an urban setting. I think that we could, you know, bolster that program at A&T, who's doing that great work already. I think that, you know, right now during COVID, I've been encouraging folks to basically plant a victory garden. Whether you can do that like you can do that on your balcony, right? You can do that in your windowsill if you have to, right? You can reimagine what that looks like. But I think people putting their hands in the soil and actually growing something themselves changes their attitude about it, which is why I'm also a big proponent for school gardens. And that is something that we could do on our, you know, on our school property throughout the state of North Carolina. Agriculture is included in the public school curriculum, but a lot of times that's either, you know, considered, especially once students get older, as like the technical field track, which again is problematic to me, because if we're not encouraging the best and the brightest to go into agriculture, it's going to be very hard to feed everybody in this world in a sustainable way moving forward, as we're going to have to adapt to climate change and the reality that will bring to us. And so talking about school gardens, horticulture programs, I think children understanding where their food comes from makes a huge difference in them understanding what to put in their bodies. A lot of people don't realize that, and this is true throughout North Carolina, that 1 in 5 children are food insecure in this state. And I think that that's a crime for a state that grows so much of the country's food and so much of the world's food. We export all across the world products that are grown here in North Carolina, but we have children that we can't take care of. And that is bad out in rural places in North Carolina. It's also bad in socioeconomically depressed areas in our urban cores, including in Mecklenburg County and in Wake County. And I think that there is a way that we can funnel some of that food that is grown here that's highly nutritious, and make sure that it gets to our children, make sure that it gets into our schools. We have to cut out some of the middlemen that are responsible for overseeing the lunchroom contracts in North Carolina. Because those people like Cisco, US Foods, they work with these large scale production farmers, these factory farmers. They, you know, a lot of times think about schools as a secondary market, so they're not providing top tier agricultural products to our children whose brains need to be, nourished, whose muscles need to be developed. And so I think there's a lot that we can do there. I think with me in this office, you will have an advocate who will fight with our partners and our elected officials on the federal level to reform the SNAP program, to see more locally grown fruits and vegetables included in that program for our, economically depressed areas and families that need that access and resource. And so I think, yes, urban gardens, community gardens, urban agriculture, looking at the future, talking about hydroponics and greenhouse grows, vertical grows, so you can grow up instead of out. I think all of those things are things that we can look at as we move forward and move agriculture forward into this century.
Mm-hmm. That'd be awesome. I know that especially the community gardens for me is essential because I've got some arugula growing on the porch and it's not looking too great. But if you look, community gardens near me, the nearest one's about 15, 20 minutes away, which is, it's about typical for this area. But it's enough of a burden where if I didn't have a car at the time, it's a pain. So it'd be good to see
schools and churches. A lot of them have, a yard or land where they could be feeding people, right? And I think that's something when you talk about feeding hungry people. Well, wouldn't it be great if we also taught people how to grow food?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. You touched on it just ever so briefly, but climate change is, I think, despite all the COVID coverage of everything, it's climate changes. That was a huge issue before, and it's kind of been pushed on the back burner, but it's going to impact every part of the state. There's a law in North Carolina where you can't make legislation or regulations based off of climate change for out east, which is going to be interesting for the sea level rise. What are you most concerned about, and what do you want to go after climate change wise in office?
Climate change is going to be the most pressing issue that affects each and every single one of us in our lifetimes and for every generation that will come after us. It is an urgent fight, and I believe that leadership starts at the top. So unless you have a commissioner who is willing to address climate change and build sustainability and resiliency into both our farm and community plans from day one, it's going to be very hard to change the hearts and minds of our farmers, some of which who may be reluctant right now or scared to say climate change out loud. Our current commissioner equivocates on whether or not climate change is real, which is just mind-blowing to me. But then we've also seen people just kind of devalue science in particular. Just look at what's happening with COVID. So I think we have to address climate change. We have to tackle it from all fronts. I think agriculture is a big way to go about doing it, just like we talked about these, the CAFOs. We talked, I think we've alluded to PFAS and the other chemicals in people's water. I traveling around the state prior to kind of the lockdown, I met with apple orchard owners up in the mountains that can't get crop insurance because growing seasons are now unpredictable. Blooming seasons are unpredictable. And it's because of climate change, even though no one would say that out loud. I've talked to folks down east and on our coast that are involved in coastal fisheries, and they honestly don't know what it's going to look like every time they turn around, or as currents change in the ocean, depending upon what storms are predicted to hit the coast this year. As the number of storms that we're going to experience increase in both intensity and frequency, the dire effects we've seen from the last few storms in particular that have affected North Carolina are just going to be exacerbated. And I don't know about y'all, but I think that writing a relief check can't be our only solution to dealing with a natural disaster. And that is the current commissioner's plan. He feels like he should be applauded for having Democrats and Republicans in the legislature agree to cut checks to folks who were struggling and hurting. I would love to see us build sustainability and resiliency and to keep that from ever even happening in the first place. And there are ways to do that. We have to prioritize these smaller farms. They're better for the environment and climate and in tackling climate change. We have to increase education and knowledge about BMP's best management practices that are more sustainable. We have to talk about soil health because everything starts in the soil. If you don't have healthy soil, you can't see anything else come from it. regenerative agriculture, some of these practices that really do great things for the local surrounding. And also, most folks will say the products that are created under those conditions tend to be not just healthier, but also tastier, and people feel better about them as well. So, I think we have to tackle climate change. I would love to create a division or redefine one of the divisions under the Department of Ag that will be dealing with tackling climate change and sustainability from day one.
That's fantastic. And the writing a check for disaster areas doesn't really cut it. I mean, there's still tons of communities out east that are still recovering from Florence, even Matthew, I believe. So it's a little more responsiveness would be excellent for everybody, I would imagine. So I've been to a couple of online events with North Carolina Democratic groups, Democratic Party groups, and at every one you've been in, you have brought up marijuana legalization. So kind of pick apart how much of that is at the discretion of the legislature? How much influence does the commissioner have in this sort of issue?
So, legislatively, we have to have our legislators create the law surrounding legalization and or put a measure on the ballot. So you need an advocate, though, who is willing to talk about what that would look like in North Carolina. And so it would be the Department of Agriculture's job, though, to then educate our farmers, give them the tools and resources necessary for how to grow it, and then probably overseeing, just like with hemp, overseeing the licensing and the testing of the product, and then also creating the market both, statewide and then nationally, internationally, for any products that result from agricultural operations here in North Carolina. So the Commissioner of Agriculture actually would have a very big role in overseeing what cannabis legalization would look like from several different angles. And, wouldn't it be nice to have a commissioner who admits the reality of the fact that, cannabis is already legal in over 30 other states, plus DC, either medicinally or recreationally or a combination thereof. So it's not a question of if, it is a question of when it's going to happen. I think while we're sitting on our hands, we've missed out on a huge economic opportunity. That additional money, income that could have come in for our state could have gone to education. I don't know about y'all, we have a number of educators in my family, including my sister who teaches at a Title I school, who had over 40 students in her classroom before COVID started. That is not fair to our children. We are, in the Constitution, we have promised, the state Constitution, we have promised children access to this high quality education, but, we continually defund the ability to make that possible here in our state. And we've seen that by funding a strong public education program that benefits employment and so many other aspects of our economy and job growth. And so that's something that we want to invest in, and it's a smart investment to make. Plus, it's just the right thing to do. But also having that additional money go to vital infrastructure improvements. There are bridges that should have been repaired and replaced 10 to 20 years ago in this state. There are some cities that have they have a moratorium on new residents because they can't afford the vital water infrastructure or sewer infrastructure in order to allow for any more residents. And so I think that marijuana legalization is a huge economic opportunity. It's also an opportunity to achieve social justice for our communities of color who for too long have been disproportionately locked up on possession charges, or because they couldn't afford, adequate representation, and they just ended up with a public defender who had to plead out by virtue of how busy their caseload was. So, I think through legalization and dismissal of past misdemeanor possession charges, not only can we begin to combat the school to prison pipeline that's keeping a bunch of Black and brown children without having at least one of their parents at home, but it's also, a way to free up some of our court system, which is already overburdened, and allow that, that system to operate and focus on other things that are far more important, instead of locking people up for something that's not a crime in over 34 other states. So I think it's a huge opportunity. The only benefit of having waited so long to legalize here in North Carolina is that we can see how other states did it, and we can see what went right and what went wrong and what we can do better.
Mm-hmm. Sort of follow up to that, what's a state that you would say that has got it right?
Well, off the top of my head, I think that there's bits and pieces from each state that have been really interesting. So like looking at what Illinois did with decriminalizing first before going into like starting to sell, the amount of money that they made in less than 2 weeks was just insane. And they wanted to make sure that that was earmarked to go, in particular, a lot of that to go to education, which I think is really amazing. So making sure that, it's a whole public good piece. There have been some states that have done some work to make sure that there's also money for drug counseling and addiction and crisis counseling. So that way, you don't see any sort of negative implications, although there's been very little research that would, suggest there's any sort of tie to marijuana being a gateway drug, which is, what we heard in the 80s, right? But there's also been, what you've seen in places like Denver, how effective that has been at reducing other forms of, drug use, like opioid use, right, through cannabis legalization. And, and they've also done things in a homeopathic way that has been, not just like they've used it for herbals or liquid form instead of just smokable cannabis. And, you've seen people use this for their health as a form of alternative medicine instead of using other addictive substances. So you can pick and choose. LA, I mean, it's been legal there for a long time. You take, I think, the best of every single state. Something else that's really important to me is the equity piece. So I wanted to actually benefit small farmers when we do legalize, instead of like just corporate giants coming in and, being able to buy up large swaths of land, especially like bankrupted farmers from, not dealing with some of our other problems like climate change. And, and I think maybe we have to consider if there's an acreage allowance or limit, that you have to be a North Carolina resident to grow it. I think there's ways around that, and there's different states that have done different things. And so I think it's just making sure that we create the best policy for people here in North Carolina.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So there are, I know with COVID, there's regions out east that don't have an ICU or ventilators at all. The nearest hospital with one might be 2 hours away. So issues in terms of, let's say, like rural issues, namely hospital access, healthcare access, and broadband access. How much of that is under, or would be under your purview?
Yeah. All like issues I love to talk about. Like the third plank of my platform is bridging that urban-rural divide that I believe has been plaguing our politics, not just on the state level, but nationally. And as like urban and rural folks have grown further apart, we don't know how to communicate with each other. So we don't know how to create policy that overwhelmingly, affects everybody in the middle. What you were talking about and alluding to with rural populations and how hard it is to find access to medical care. The average travel time across the country for like folks that live in rural areas is at least an hour to get to a hospital. And that's that's average. And then again, when you get to that hospital, if it's a regional health center, you don't know what type of supplies they're going to have on hand. They're not equipped to deal with a major outbreak like this pandemic. When you're going to start seeing how, and you're already seeing this, how rural America is beginning to feel the brunt of COVID-19. That's why things like, access to rural broadband access, where you can access telehealth services, is more important now than ever. It's so important for educational equity and outcomes for our children. I think before this disaster, we shouldn't have had children have to go sit in parking lots at McDonald's or libraries to access free Wi-Fi in order to do their homework. I think that has become, people have become very cognizant of that now that their children are home and their whole educational outcomes are dependent upon access to Wi-Fi. So, to bridge this urban-rural divide, because you've got, consumers and policymakers overwhelmingly living in the urban areas, and then the farmers overwhelmingly living in these rural areas, you have to make investments in broadband access, Right now, that's how people are going to school. That's how people are doing their jobs. That's how people are accessing crucial government services, including SNAP benefits right now, and telehealth services. And it's also, we have to make an investment in rural health. And I talk about rural health because if you are not healthy, you can't be a productive citizen in our, and you can't contribute to the economy. Farmers, given that their average age, they are in the at-risk group for COVID-19 and a number of other health issues. You work one of the hardest jobs there is out there, and you have very little access to healthcare resources. Some of these folks don't have health insurance or did it before the marketplace. And, that's so important to me because as a result of not dealing with climate change or some of these other issues that small farmers in particular have been facing over the last few years in America and in North Carolina, we've seen the largest number of farm bankruptcies in the last few years, particularly here in the southeastern United States. And as a result of that increased farm stress and those bankruptcies, we're seeing an increase in the number of farmers committing suicide. And to me, that's why investments in rural health are even more important, and looking at how we can go about destigmatizing mental health counseling, especially in rural areas, so those farmers never have to make that awful decision to end their lives. And as far as commissioner, what you have access to, well, first of all, you can be an advocate. You can use that bully pulpit to encourage the legislature to make X, Y, or Z priorities. You also oversee a number of different budgets, or you work with a number of different nonprofits throughout the state that oversee agricultural research and development. I think by pushing harder and saying we should look at farm stressors and what's encouraging these farmers to result in kind of this mental health crisis in the community is something that the commissioner can do that way as well, by working with all of our partners. Because there's something like over 1,000 different partners that you're working with, different agencies and groups and nonprofits that are involved in the agricultural space. And in our agricultural research institutions, this is something that we could talk about, we can think about. Agriculture does have a say in what's happening with rural broadband. There was a study done by the Rural Center too, talking about testing and looking at broadband connectivity rates, especially in rural areas or amongst our farming community. And so, I think it's clear to me that there's an opportunity when you talk about restructuring the divisions that the department oversees, looking at AI, because there is a future in agricultural tech and looking at AI and doing things that way. You would also have to look at broadband access. For me, I see it as also a way you can factor that in to the marketing department at the Department of Ag, because if farmers don't have the access to the technology to compete in the global markets, they can't. If they don't know how to, interact with consumers or direct ship or sell online, they can't do it. And so I think that there are funding and budget priorities and ways that it can fall under the Department of Ag's work.
Mm-hmm. That's excellent, because there's I know just from talking to people, at least, like, even if you live in not say like Wilmington, but like even just outside, it's pretty, I don't know if anyone here's run into it, but it can be pretty iffy at times, off the beaten path.
Oh yeah, I have farmers who reach out to me and they're like, I was like, well, can I, will you help me with this policy that we're developing? Because we're writing a comprehensive farm plan, our vision for the future of agriculture in North Carolina. And I believe in trusting scientists and leaders in their field and experts and farmers, people who are doing this work every single day, which is the way I think it should be, instead of just asking a few big industries to help write recommendations. And some of these farmers, bless them, they're like, yeah, well, I can go over to my neighbors. They've got a computer. It's like, and their neighbor is 2 miles down the road, and they're like, if you just let me know, I'll give me a call. I'll I'll drive over there and check my email. So it's just, yeah, there's places that live very differently than you or I do. But I think in order to see us really evolve as a society, people need access to technology.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that was something that I think Hillary Clinton was pushing in 2016. That was nice to see, is part of the, how do you help people that are displaced by the new global economy? Well, you give them access to internet.
Well, it's information, and information is power. And the other thing is we had folks that worked in the department when Troxler first took over, and they said at least they thought it was at least a year and a half or more before they even saw a computer on his desk in the office. Like, he does not use internet, he does not use email. So I think, wouldn't it be important to have someone who truly understands what they're doing and talking about, seeing those priorities?
Absolutely. All right, come up here. 8 minutes to 8-ish to go. So this is kind of a big one, sort of more environmental quality, but part of the neoliberal project's ethos is valuing strong institutions that help ensure a more equitable society. And for North Carolina, there's a lot of issues, but one of the big ones is large-scale pollution events. Just like everywhere we have them, but there's the Duke Energy coal ash ponds all up and down the rivers, especially out here. The AgMart produce pesticide case, and the Gen X pollution at Fort Bragg, which I think everyone absolutely knows about. Does the Department of Agriculture have a role in the investigation, enforcement, and regulation of these types of events?
So most of that probably falls under DENR and DEQ and Division of Water Quality as well. And then on the national level too, natural resources. But I would say the pesticide part as well. So that falls under the North Carolina Department of Ag, kind of overseeing the licensing and application of pesticide use. I know a number of people that use pesticides as responsibly as is possible. But for, all the good guys, there are plenty of bad actors that don't. Again, a lot of these large scale operations would rather just, do whatever they can quickly and easily to get by to make a profit. And they don't mind paying whatever fees or ending up in lawsuits forever afterwards. They don't care about the human toll. And to me, whether I'm talking about immigration or climate change or seeing, or talking about small family farmers, I think what's really important is putting a face on the policy I'm creating. So putting that humanity back into governing. And that's something we're missing on most levels, I would argue, right now. And so, so dealing with pesticides, I think that in particular, when you talk about these large scale animal ag operation cases, some like the Smithfield Foods case, I think would probably be a little bit more relevant. The department and Farm Bureau partner on a bunch of stuff, and they have largely decided that these are nuisance suits and they are on the side of the big operators. And, while I support our farmers, I find it hard to believe that there's not a better way that we can do things. And I wouldn't be running if I didn't think that there was. And I will tell you, I talked to a farmer that was involved in the lawsuit, who, a lot of them, it's actually really sad stories. They had no other choice, but because again, we subsidize and give power to the big guys, they couldn't continue to compete while all their neighbors had, signed contracts with Prestige and Smithfield or Purdue, whoever. They couldn't continue to compete and do what they were doing at the same price while all their neighbors had kind of sold out or entered into contracts with the big boys who also oversee processing. So like, the slaughter and processing of the animals as well. Because that's another problem, is a lot of the slaughterhouses, the mid-size and small slaughterhouses, have also been basically taken off the market in the last few years and unable to compete, which again makes it harder for small producers to be competitive. We just keep setting up the small farmers to fail, or making it harder and harder for them to succeed. And so, what was really sad is some of these farmers I was talking to, they wanted to do the right thing, and they hate being seen as social pariahs. They hate feeling like they've let their neighbors down, that they just felt like they had no choice. And now they're entered into these contracts that last for, a term of at least 15 months, depending upon the contract. And these big companies own so many stages of the production. And if they try to leave, they're going to go bankrupt, right? And what we just already talked about with bankrupt and mental health, that's problematic because there's an obvious connection there to those folks. They feel hopeless. They feel like there's no other opportunity or choice for them. They feel like if there's a natural disaster, at least they're doctored into this contract, so they'll be safe for that because they don't feel like they can trust the department to help them get through if they were a small farmer on their own dealing with a natural disaster. So there's, that right there. But we have to make it viable to not rely on these guys. The last thing I'll say on that is one of the other farmers came up with, he studied, he worked with brilliant scientists on this, ways to mitigate some of the waste materials and lagoon spray. And so to reduce lagoon spray in a way to be able to separate each of the components of waste from nutrients, from volatile chemicals, from water in the animal waste, in a way that you could then resell the nutrients for the right thing and remove the volatile compounds that get washed into the drinking water sources. But they got laughed out of the Department of Ag when they pitched it. There's folks that want to do conversion and install renewable energy sources on their farms, but they often don't get the support they need from the department to do it. There's people that are talking about methane capture, to be able to put that back into the natural gas pipeline instead of just letting that methane and those compounds deteriorate air quality. There's so many things that could be done, but we're making it very hard for individual good actors to do them.
Absolutely. And like you mentioned before, A&T and NC State do incredible agricultural work, and we should definitely be encouraging that sort of innovative stuff because these issues are also happening elsewhere.
Right.
All right, I guess to wrap it up real quick, how are you handling campaigning in the COVID era, in the quarantines? What have you found to be successful? If anyone here is interested in if they like what they're hearing, if they want to help you out, what can they do in these sort of strange times?
Yeah. Well, I think we're all living in a weird place, right? Like, you've got to think about your physical health, but I think it's also important to think about your mental and emotional health as well to get through this, especially if you live alone. For me, my emotional, psychological release is getting to go out to my farm and do work at least every week, every couple weeks, and do stuff with the planting and with my pruning of my fruit trees or the nut trees. That's been great for me. And people have seen a connection. Getting out in nature has been really mentally, just like an opportunity for folks that normally wouldn't have time to go kind of do those things. You have it now. I encourage you to social distance. I encourage you to wear a mask whenever you're going out in public. Trust scientists, trust epidemiologists and virologists, the people who are, on the front lines of this. I encourage you to trust them. If you order food from any restaurants, do it directly. Tip them, especially if they are restaurants that are buying from, local producers and farmers. I would encourage each of you, if, instead of just going to the grocery store, you've got the Charlotte Farmers Market, you've got some other small farmers markets. I encourage you to maybe think about what you can get from those markets as well, outside of just doing all your shopping at a grocery store. It's, those farmers work so hard to create that high quality product for you. And a lot of times when you can't find eggs or dairy or meat on the shelves in your grocery store, you can find it at these farmers markets or through these local producers and growers. And so, I think politically, I spend a lot of time on Zoom. I think everyone has to watch. We're all getting close to getting Zoom fatigue these days. And especially because there seems to be no derivation between, whatever hours of the day someone is hosting events. I'm just grateful for the opportunity to reach as many people as possible. I hope that, we had a good dialogue tonight and that, people are responsive to it. I encourage you to go check out our website. It's just jennawadsworth.com, and I can drop that in the chat. And my website has my link to all my social. So pretty pithy on Twitter. If you like someone who has so Twitter, on Instagram and our Facebook page. I'll put everything up for my videos and thoughts on what's happening to labor practices in agriculture, to me out on my actual farm. And I'm just excited about what's to come. I don't know what I don't know what the next few months campaigning are going to look like. We've had to change a bunch of things. Like we can't do these outdoor rallies or farm events, which makes me very sad because the state is incredibly beautiful. And we are fortunate to live in this state. That's why I think it's so important to protect our natural spaces. And I guess one of the kind of last things I'll say, we are really proud of the campaign that we've been running. Not only do we have a diverse staff and a large number of interns, high school and college from throughout North Carolina. They're also very diverse and they look like the state that I would like to represent, which I think is so important, that diversity of opinions. But we have been endorsed by organizations that had never endorsed in this race before because they were excited about a platform that was inclusive and looked at how agriculture affects every single community's lives and all the good that we could do in this office. Nationally, Emily's List, which is a pro-choice organization looking at women in politics. Emily's List, People for the American Way, basically the people who started like ACLU and civil liberties groups. Their Next Up Victory Fund has supported and endorsed me. The LGBTQ Victory Fund has endorsed me. And then on the state level, we've got everything from, AFL-CIO, because I talk about unions and organizers and laborers. We've got, Lillian's List, found out tonight, NARAL, Planned Parenthood, South Atlantic. We have the Sierra Club, Equality NC. We have a number of regional groups throughout the state, and then other teacher and advocacy organizations. So we're really proud. We built a diverse coalition. We're going to continue to build on that, and I hope you all will follow along.
Fantastic. I know at least on the Charlotte chapter does. When she says pithy on Twitter, it's one way you could describe it. It's good. It's good fun. Well, that wraps it up. For a couple minutes over, but that'll be okay. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. For kind of late on.
Sorry, I saw there was a question. I don't know if it's public.
Elaine's.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just quickly, organic is great. I think we've almost super saturated the market and we make it very hard for producers to switch to organic. For instance, on my family farm, I basically utilize organic practices, but I'm not certified or licensed. It's expensive. We have to make sure that we give farmers an economic incentive to do it. We also have to make it possible for them. Farmers I've talked to, especially in Western North Carolina, want to do this, but it takes about 3 years to make the full transition. So you need a department that is supportive of it. And then let's see, there was another,
promoting
pollinator friendly. Yes. There were a lot of things that the department used to do with like wildflowers being planted all over the highway and everything else, working with DOT and the universities. But pollinator-friendly practices, again, this goes back to education, starting with our schools, talking about community gardens and pollinator gardens, reduction of these harmful pesticides and fertilizers that are literally killing our pollinators. And again, that takes having a commissioner that prioritizes those things from day one.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. I think that's it. Excellent. All right. Again, thank you for coming out and answering our questions. I hope everyone's enjoyed it. Again, I love doing these. These are really fun. And I'm looking for the next one. We'll have our next meetup in 2 weeks. I'll put all the details in the usual places and I'll let you know. Thank you so much for coming out.
Thank you. Bye, y'all.